Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Conor Gray's Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be asking the question of what if Britain stayed neutral in World War One? Now this ties on quite nicely with our previous video, which was looking at the Treaty of Versailles and what was less harsh. Now what we focused on in that video is looking at the war aims of the victorious allies, so Britain, France and America. However, it's important to recognise that the Germans too had war aims, and so that's what a large part of this video is going to be focusing on. Now, I got the inspiration for this in two parts. One, because of Alternative History Hub, who've done a video similar to this, but not exactly in the same level of detail, etc. So hopefully this video is meant as like a complement to that, and not as a kind of, I'm not trying to beef them. Just chill, okay? The second inspiration for this video is Peter Hitchens, who made a big speech a few years ago in which he said that the EU was Germany by other means. Now, that's obviously debatable. I don't know what your stance on Brexit and the EU is, but regardless, his basic thesis within that was that the EU was basically an extension of what Germany's war aims in World War One had been. So again, that's completely up to you guys what you take from that. I would definitely have a link in the description, and obviously put in the comment section what your kind of opinions on that are. But regardless, this is kind of the inspiration for these two videos, and it kind of got me thinking, what would have actually happened if Britain had stayed neutral in World War One? Now, just for a little bit of context, for those who don't know, basically the war's popping off. This country is declaring war on that country. So a very long list of countries, like one declaring war on the next, and then the next, because of this entangling alliances that each country had. The Central Powers was Austria and Germany, and also later Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire. And then the Allies were basically made up of the so-called Triple Entente, which was Russia, France and the UK. Now Britain wasn't as tightly linked within this military alliance as France and Russia had been. And this is partly because of something which has been long lasting in British diplomatic history, which was the idea of so-called splendid isolationism, where basically Britain would focus on its colony and would only intervene in the continent when there was a major threat. And so in this video we're going to explore some of the effects that the war had on Britain and what chance Britain could have had to have stayed out of it. Now the reason that was given for Britain entering the war was to do with the so-called Schlieffen Plan, which was the plan for Germany to knock out France and then be able to focus all their might on Russia. And the way that they had planned to take out France was to invade through Belgium. Now Belgium was a neutral country, and within the Treaty of London of 1839, which helped to set up the state of Belgium, Britain had some guarantees that if Belgian neutrality was ever threatened, then Britain would intervene on the side of Belgium. If the Schlieffen Plan had just gone through France and ignored Belgium, then there's a chance that Britain could have ended up staying out of the war. So first off, what would have been the effects of Germany not entering the war? Now it's widely been said that Germany came very, very close at multiple times in the war to actually winning it. And without the added thing of the British Army being there, especially in those decisive months, in the Battle of the Marne, etc., it seems quite clear that Germany would have just steamrolled straight onto Paris, as they had done in the War of 1870. So the Germans never counted on the British being there, and they certainly didn't count on them being a major military force on land. Famously, Kaiser Wilhelm, when it was said that the British considered joining the war, he famously said that Dreadnoughts have no wheels. So Dreadnoughts are big, massive battleships, and it was basically a snub basically saying that while Britain had a very large navy, which is something we'll get onto in a little bit, they had a very weak army in relation to the Germans, and so it's very much suspected that the British army could just be swept aside by the much larger, much better trained German army. However, by Britain joining the war, it basically stopped this collapse on the Western Front, and thereby saving France, and thereby making sure that Germany had to fight very long and very hard on two-front war for 4 years. And this obviously bought just enough time for Germany to end up collapsing, especially with the addition of American troops in from 1917 onwards. So Germany was in a very strong position to have won that war, and they, as I said, could have done it multiple times within our own timeline, never mind if the British never joined in the war. So within this, we've had to first talk about what the German war aims were. Within Europe, they had this idea of Mittel Europa. And this is kind of what Pete Hitchens was basically talking about in terms of he basically tried to say that the EU is a kind of has been a setup similar to what this plan was. So the idea of the Mittel Europa was that Germany, for its geopolitical position in Europe, being at the very heart of Europe, having a large population, having a very strong army, having a very strong economy, that Germany would naturally dominate the continent. It wouldn't have to occupy the whole of the continent as the Nazis tried to do, but they could basically set up independent, seemingly independent, like sovereign states. But these states would actually be beholden to Germany. They would be puppet states. They would be satellite states to the German Reich. Now we get a taste of this overall German war aim in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So for those who don't know, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was in 1918, it was basically a case in which the Germans had won the war on the Eastern Front. Now von Clausewitz famously once said that war is politics by different means. War is one way of achieving political aims, but if you can go for another way, then why not? Germany had obviously been fighting with Russia for 3 years, and the Russian military had been beaten in the field, had been pushed far, far back into its own territory because of the large incompetencies of the Russian military. However, they obviously were still fighting, and the amount of soldiers that they lost on the front didn't matter because Russia was like, no, we have to keep winning. We can't like pull out. We can't we can't let down our allies. So Germany hatched a cunning plan in which they basically got the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, to take over Russia. You had the February Revolution in February of 1917, in which the Tsar and his government was overthrown, and then what was installed was a provisional government, a democratic government. However, this provisional government was still focused on winning the war, well, at least trying to. However, Lenin's Bolsheviks, they wanted to get out of this so-called imperialist war, so these guys were communists, and they wanted Russia to leave this imperialist war and to basically like focus on setting up communism. So Lenin was in exile in Switzerland, and so obviously for him to get back to Russia, he'd have to go through German territory. So the Germans set up what was known as the sealed train, and so this is where Lenin was put on a train and he was shipped up to the north of Germany and then set on a boat, and this boat went to Finland, and then through Finland went into St. Petersburg. And then from St. Petersburg, this is where he launched his October Revolution, or as some have called the October coup. Him and his Bolsheviks basically did like an armed coup. They took over like the main things of like government within St. Petersburg, and from there they were able to take over the Russian state. And once they took control of Russia, then they end up taking Russia out of the war. However, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was a very harsh treaty in which the Germans basically imposed their will on the Bolsheviks, because the Bolsheviks just wanted peace at any price. Yeah, this has been one of their main aims. It was peace, land and bread, and yeah, they needed that peace part. And that's because part of the reason why the provisional government was so unpopular was because they'd continued this war. And so when the Germans said, right, this is our war aims, this is what we want from you, they had no choice but to submit. And so we can see on the map here what ended up being taken from Russia as part of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. And obviously you can see quite a lot of the territory of Russia being taken off and being created into independent like satellite states under the German yoke. This region here represents 25% of the Russian Empire's population and about 90% of its coal deposits, which means that Russia, which was a very strong country at the time, Germany was very worried that it would soon overtake it. By, I believe, 1930, it was predicted that the Russian economy would overtake the German economy. So Germany thought, we're going to need to take them out quickly. And actually there's some estimates that say it could have happened as early as 1916, although those sources are kind of dispute. So by taking Russia out of the war and by taking its most valuable territory, it basically would have crippled Russia and made it so that they would never be a threat. You basically neutralise the threat from the east. And then in the west, what they planned to do was basically to take the industrial northeastern part of France and then all of the kind of channel ports like Boulogne and Calais, and also to swallow up big chunks of Belgium within the German Reich. Within the whole of Europe, the idea was that even countries like France would have to join this Mittel Europa, this idea of Germany being at the very centre of Europe, and all the other countries being client states to it. Add to this the aims that the German colonial empire had, which was to basically set up Middle Africa. Within the continent of Africa, Germany had 4 colonies, and as you can see on the map, you have Tanganyika, which is modern day Tanzania, you have Namibia in the south, and you have Cameroon in the west. So the idea of the Germans was basically to link all these territories together. So if Germany had taken on this territory, they would have had a lot of resources, they would have had access to rubber, access to all sorts of minerals, and all sorts of metals. By doing this, Germany would have expanded its colonial empire, it would have basically taken control over most of Europe, it would have been the unquestioned dominant power in Europe and arguably in the world at that time. Add on top of that, the reparations, which we spoke about with Versailles and how they were very harsh. Yes, the Germans also wanted the French to pay reparations for this war, which would have amounted to 10 billion marks. So just to give an idea of this 10 billion marks would have paid for all of the veterans of that war, all the German veterans of that war, and then also paid off Germany's entire national debt. So that's a huge amount of money in the grand scheme of things, yeah? So Germany would have been debt-free, and it would have been paid for all by the defeated French. And all of this came as part of the plan known as the September Programme, which was obviously set up in September of 1914. So this is when the German High Command came together and said, this is our war aims, this is what we want the map of Europe and the world to look like. And so now that we've covered the German war aims, we have to look at the effects of the war on Britain. So Britain spent a lot of money on this war, it bankrupted itself, it went from being the world's largest creditor to the world's largest debtor. So just to give an idea of this, by the war's end, 40% of government spending in Britain was devoted purely to paying off the interest on the debt from this war. And actually, the debt itself was not paid off until 2015. Yes, you heard that right, 2015. So the war ended in 1918. It took the British government until 2015 to pay off the war. So that gives you an idea of just how indebted they were. Add on top of that the shocks that end up happening as a result of this. So Britain, which had always been renowned for being, for having a very stable currency in the pound, its inflation doubled between the years of 1914 to 1920, and the value of the pound actually fell by 61%. So this, in terms of consumer spending, it contracted by 61% throughout the course of the war. So Britain was dead broke by the end of this. Yes, it ended up winning. Yes, it played a decisive role in this war, but it came out of it as a very much weaker country. So if Germany hadn't invaded Belgium and had simply taken out France as they had in the War of 1870, then there's almost no chance that the British would have joined that war. Now, World War One is etched into the consciousness of every British person, you know. So every year on the 11th of November, we remember and honour our war dead from that war with a 2-minute silence. It's had a huge impact on us, yeah. Because of the amount of troops who died in that war, it numbered about 900,000. This is much more than we end up losing as World War II as a country. So in that regard, we wouldn't have been as affected, it wouldn't have changed us psychologically as a nation, in having that lost generation, as it was called, of men who never lived and never survived the war. But why did Britain even consider joining the Allies in the first place? Prior to World War One, Germany had overtaken Britain as the dominant power in Europe. So this is Germany just with 5 colonies compared to Britain, which at the time had the world's largest empire, and actually the largest empire the world had ever seen, with colonies such as India, etc., which we've covered in our previous videos covering the British Empire and the empire in India specifically. So Britain felt that they were being overtaken by their rival. And it didn't help that the Kaiser, who was actually the grandson of Queen Victoria, was also very hostile to Britain and wanted to outcompete them in the imperial game and also in the naval game, which obviously Britain being an island, it could never accept. From 1906, with the first Dreadnought being built, the Germans were like, oh, I want one as well, I want one as well. Kaiser Wilhelm wanted to overtake Britain in the production of having the largest navy and in having the most number of dreadnoughts. And this is what has started what's known as the naval arms race between Britain and Germany. Now, many people say that the naval arms race directly led to World War One. it was a contributing factor, but it alone wasn't the reason why Britain ended up going to war. It hardened relationships between Britain and Germany and made Britain more hostile towards Germany and more seeing it as an enemy and as a rival. But it didn't directly lead to World War One. And the reason for this is because the naval arms race was actually over many, many years beforehand. So Britain builds the first dreadnoughts in 1906. Then, year by year, the Germans start to build some more, and the British public panic and go, no, we can't have the Germans, we can't have the Germans out competing us. So we go, right, we're going to build even more ships. And yeah, it gets to the point where the Germans can't keep up. I think there was only 2 years, I believe in 1908 and 1909, where German production either matched or surpassed the British. And we'll read out some of the stats now. So the British in 1914 had 29 dreadnoughts, they had 209,000 personnel, and they had 2.2 million tonnage of ships. The Germans, by comparison, had 17 dreadnoughts, they had 79,000 personnel, and they had 1 million tonnage of ships. So you can see that, the gap is pretty big between Britain and Germany. However, obviously, a massive concern for the British is that at the time, 58% of their caloric intake came from imports from abroad. So that means that 58% of all the calories that were consumed in Britain came from abroad. And so Britain being an island, if you cut off our trade routes with the rest of the world, then you could starve the British out. And so the Germans realised we don't have to spend this huge amount of money on these big battleships. We can basically set up U-boats, which are basically submarines, and we can sink the British naval merchant fleet and basically starve Britain out. And so this was a big concern for Britain going into the war. So I think that if, for instance, Britain had been neutral in the war, Germany would have taken over Europe as was laid out in the September programme. But I think you still would have had hostilities between Britain and Germany, and if it ever popped off into a future war, then I think that Germany, with a lot more reach, might have been able to actually kind of like close the net as such, and actually the navy would be in a much stronger position to actually start to starve the British out a bit more. There's not anything that would have necessarily necessitated Britain to have like gone to war with Germany, and also Germany had no aims of like invading Britain. Both in World War One and in World War Two, Germany was never really that serious about invading Britain. Like, so from a British perspective, we've had 2 world wars with the Germans, and so the relationship between us, we've always seen that as being the main thing. However, from a German perspective, Britain has always been a sideshow. Britain's always been a kind of, they're getting involved? Why are they getting involved for? And the same thing we can kind of see now with regard to Brexit. We can see other nations may be like, oh no, we want Britain to stay. And obviously for Britain, the relationship with the continent is like a very, very key thing. So that's why the Brexit debate has been so tumultuous over the last few years. However, from a German perspective, they're like, well, we'd rather you guys were in, but at the end of the day, we're not too bothered. Like, if you want to go, then go. Don't make too much fuss about it. As the old saying goes, there are no such thing as permanent alliances. There's only permanent interests. So Britain has permanent interests with regard to maintaining access to the open sea and to world trade and stuff, it being an island nation. But Germany's aim has always been to have dominance over the continent, either through violent means or through peaceful means, right? So that's just the geopolitical interest of each country. America, for instance, it has Canada to the north and it has Mexico to the south, and it has 2 oceans at either side. So it can very easily focus in on itself. Russia obviously has many, many borders with many different countries who have invaded them in the past. Their geopolitical aim is obviously to maintain those borders and to try and take control over their near abroad. So each country has their own geopolitical goals, and that's what they try to kind of ensure. But you know what you can ensure? You can ensure that this video hits 20 likes. Yeah, so all you got to do is just lightly tap the like button. Some people get a bit triggered because they're like, I don't want to smash the like button. I paid a lot of money for this laptop, so can I not, like, surely I can just find a better way rather than just going, just hitting it. Yeah, just lightly tap it and then it goes blue, and then more people see the videos and more people see the channel and more people learn more things. These videos are big brain, so if you want more people to get big brain like me and like you, then you need to hit that like button. Share the love, baby. Share the love. Anyway, back to the video. Hey. So now we've dealt with the German war aims and we've dealt with the effect that had on Britain. We're also going to spend the rest of this video talking about some of the other effects on other, relatively speaking, minor players within the game. So first off, we're going to start with Ireland. So in our timeline, the Irish Home Bill was about to be pushed through in 1914, which basically would have given the Irish a parliament. Canada had its own Dominion Parliament. Australia, New Zealand, all these different, the so-called like white colonies around the empire, they had really been given a lot of like self-governance. And so Ireland basically wanted to have its own parliament. And this was a very contentious issue in Britain at the time. The Liberal government were sympathetic to it, however, many of the Conservatives and also many of the Unionist, like kind of politicians, were very much opposed to it. In particular, the Unionists in the north of Ireland, which is basically the Protestants in Ulster. So they were very hostile to Irish unity. And so in 1912, for instance, you had the Ulster Covenant. You had a lot of paramilitary, like people in the north of Ireland who almost started an armed uprising with regard to this issue. So Britain in 1914 was focusing on Ireland. And so when this war started off in the Balkans and then spread into the rest of Europe, it then put the issue of Ireland kind of on the back foot, because like, yeah, we need to fight this war. That's the main aim. However, obviously for the Irish standpoint, they were like, hold on, what about us? You can't just, I know you're fighting this war, but like, we want home rule. We want home rule. And this led to the Easter Rising of 1916. So this was a very small number of Irish nationalists who basically tried to take over Dublin and basically kind of kick the British army out. However, this wasn't very popular at the time in Ireland, and so these men basically end up being held up in the post office in Dublin, which you can still see to this day. Yeah, they were just held up in this thing here. But the British, because these men had been armed by the Germans, so they were using German rifles, and it's in the middle of a war. And it's kind of seen from a British perspective as kind of like stab in the back, like, hold on, we're fighting this war here, and you lot are all trying to like break away from the empire and stuff. As a result, the British cracked down really, really hard. They sent in troops, they sent in like big guns, and they basically bombed the place to bits. And when they actually captured the men, they put them on trial and then put them before a firing squad. These Irish rebels being killed in this way, this is what changed Irish public opinion, because up until that point, they've been happy with constitutional change, with constitutional reform, with more and more autonomy. At this point now, the people in Ireland were fully against the British Empire, and they wanted independence. And so this, bit by bit, end up leading towards the Irish Wars for Independence and eventually the creation of the Irish state. So if you hadn't had Britain being involved in World War One, more likely than not, Ireland would have got its own parliament. Maybe at some point they might have voted to have left the empire and such, but it would have been through a much more peaceful means, and it probably would have been a lot further down the road, because as long as the Irish had their own self-government, it might have been a situation where, for instance, the Scottish Parliament now has had government for the last 20 years, and yes, there's been referendums for them to leave, but it's been relatively peaceful. And so there's nothing to suggest that Irish independence or greater autonomy also couldn't have been achieved in a much more peaceful way. On top of this, we have to look at Italy. Italy joined the war in 1915 on the side of the Allies, because basically what they wanted to do is they want to, in the middle of the war, it was like, right, if we jump in, we might be able to take some territory from the Austrians. However, the Italian campaign was terrible, and the Treaty of Versailles, we didn't really cover this much in the previous video. The Italians, they didn't really get much at all, right? And because of this, it's a big dent to Italian national pride. They felt that they'd spent all this money and lost all these men for nothing, really. And so as a result, people like Benito Mussolini then end up rising to power and end up taking over Italy and end up setting up fascism in Italy. And so with Germany taking France and Russia out of the war in the autumn/winter of 1914, there wouldn't have been much opportunity for Italy to join the war, because it would have really been over. And so, yeah, they wouldn't have just jumped in like that. And so if they hadn't just jumped in like that, and they hadn't end up fighting this war that was kind of disastrous for them, then there would have been no rise of fascism as we had in our timeline. However, France most likely would have turned fascist. So this is something we discussed in the previous video as well. Fascism actually started off as a concept in France. France really had a very strong highly nationalistic movement within it. And so if they'd lost two wars with Germany, like one in 1870 and one now in 1914, the French right would have really rose to prominence, and I think that they would have like taken over. It's not to say you would have had like a French Hitler, but they would have been very, very bitter from this war. However, France, obviously not being Germany, would not have been able to, if they had decided to have fought a Second World War, they would have just lost because Germany was not France. Germany was much more powerful. So France trying to start another war with Germany would have just got completely crushed, especially with the Germans occupying the industrial heartland in the northeast. France would have just had no capacity to have actually done anything. And so like the French, yeah, you might have had a bit of fascism, but at the same time, sooner or later, they would have had to inevitably kind of submit to like German dominance on the continent. Next, we're going to talk about Russia. So Russia, the October Revolution wouldn't have happened, and so as a result, Russia wouldn't have gone communist, and all the ripple effects of that, which are too numerous to mention in this video, wouldn't have happened. You most likely wouldn't have had many communist states, certainly not like in Eastern Europe. The effect of Russia not going communist, that's a whole separate video. But what we can be assured of is that Russia at that time was becoming heavily nationalistic. In particular, it was becoming very nationalistic around the identity of uniting the Slavic people, and this would have been the main war aim of the Russians. So the Russian provisional government would have been democratic, but they would have been very, very right-wing. And so they would want to have taken over many of these satellite states, such as Ukraine and Belarus, which obviously had been taken away from them by the Germans. However, without the Ukraine and Belarus and all these other territories, Russia's capacity to have actually fought back would have been very limited. Add to this as well, the Ottomans, who also joined in the war in 1914, they wouldn't have ended up having to go to war with Britain. So as a result, a lot of the Ottoman Empire wouldn't have like been taken away from them. You wouldn't have had the Arab Revolt, which was funded and trained by the British. You wouldn't have had the British taking over Palestine and Iraq, which obviously led indirectly to the creation of the State of Israel. So yeah, so Turkey, like kind of the Ottoman Empire, would have stayed largely intact. And also they would have probably expanded into Russia through the Caucasus, so they would have taken modern day Azerbaijan, Armenia and Georgia. And so if they had had the oil fields in Baku, which is in Azerbaijan, then Russia would have been even more weak, and they would have been even less likely to be able to have waged a successful war against like the Germany and her allies. Now, if the Ottoman Empire hadn't been dismantled in this way, you would have the discovery of oil in the Gulf states. Add to this, obviously, them taking the oil fields in Baku. You know, the Ottoman Empire would have had a lot of oil money, and so they could have used a lot of that money to develop like their own empire. So the Ottoman Empire, its economy had really been kind of like stagnant for a long time. However, in the years leading up to World War One, they were starting to modernize, they were starting to catch up, and so if they hadn't completely disintegrated as happened in our timeline, then they might have been able to kind of revamp themselves somewhat. And then finally, for our American audience, yes, America would have stayed out of the war because obviously it would have ended in 1914 and America joined in 1917. So America probably would have just maintained friendly relationship with the Germans. You had a large German-American population in America, as we've really like discussed in previous videos. The effect that World War I had on their community was that because of a lot of anti-German sentiment, a lot of German culture ended up being suppressed. So prior to the war, you had a lot of German-speaking newspapers in America. You had towns where people would commonly just speak in German. And so a lot of this culture ended up being suppressed. And so German Americans, the reason we don't really think of them as a big kind of like ethnic group like in America today is because they kind of just end up having to blend in with the rest of the population. So expect in America, which is a lot more German. So also some of the effects of this would have been in the Prohibition movement. After the war, you end up having Prohibition, where the sale of alcohol was banned throughout the whole of America. And a big part of the anti-booze kind of propaganda was to say that a lot of the beer making companies such as Budweiser, etc., were actually of German origin, and therefore they were tied to the German war effort. And so if you hadn't had this war, I'm not saying that Prohibition wouldn't have happened, but it was one extra thing that helped to lead towards Prohibition. And on an international stage, you know, you wouldn't have had the League of Nations being set up because Woodrow Wilson wouldn't have been able to really push it. America still would have traded with Germany. It wouldn't have had any problem with that at all. You know, its economy would have continued to grow, but it would have been a sleeping giant. It would have been a country which could at any point kind of spring onto the world stage. But World War One was really a game changer in terms of how Americans viewed foreign policy and like the problems of like the rest of the world. And so yeah, America was already pretty isolationist in this timeline. Without a World War One, then yeah, they probably would have just remained that way because with an ocean on either side, and like I said, Canada and Mexico on its borders, it didn't have to worry about anything. Yeah, I ain't worried about anything. I can't sing all the lyrics to that words. I can't sing all the lyrics to that song, but you know what I'm saying. So for the people who are disappointed that I'm not going to be talking about how, you know, Germany would be taking over the whole world and like how 2021 would look completely, you know, I'm not doing that. As furthest I can extend this timeline, it's probably like the 1930s at very much a stretch. Like World War One is such a pivotal like moment in world history that its ripple effects, the whole of the 20th century completely kind of falls apart. You know, decolonization, like the rise of like kind of communism, like the rise of America, everything is all, you know, it's all tied in. The creation of the state of Israel, like everything's all tied in within this war. So I'm not even going to start to attempt to unpick all of the long term effects of Britain not entering this war. And so, yeah, with that being said, stay tuned for our next video, which is going to be looking at what if the British had actually succeeded in Gallipoli. So that's the campaign with regard to the British fighting the Ottomans. So yeah, definitely stay tuned for that. Also check out some of our other videos from this playlist, and also just check out some of the other videos from our channel as well. We've got some really great content. We've got a lot more in store for you as well. And yeah, like I said, hit the like button, and once you've done that, then you're free to go. Have a good day, and bye.